Okay, so welcome to this online recording. My name is Rob Hammond, and I'm going to be delivering this lecture to Quattuor Coronacci Lodge on the 12th September 2024. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint. And then we'll begin. Okay, so minimize myself so you don't have to watch me speaking. Okay, so thank you for logging into this short lecture. The title of the lecture is Freemasonry in North Wales, 1727-1851, widely scattered and doomed to fail. And in essence, what the lecture is about is looking at the early years of Freemasonry in North Wales and examining some of the reasons why it actually failed to gain a foothold and really struggled to become assimilated into North Wales society during this period. And then from that, whether we can actually extrapolate that and apply it to any of the provinces elsewhere. So why we're looking at this? Well, one of the reasons is North Wales has been a slightly understudied, under-researched area in terms of Freemasonry. And it claims to be the first province to have its Grand Master appointed by the Grand Lodge in London in 1727, which is true, which also means that it's claiming to have its will be claiming to have its tercentenary in 2-3 years' time. And one of the things that comes out in the paper, which can be read via the QC website, is this questioning whether this claim is really sensible, if that makes sense. Okay, which is a sort of slight point of contention. Okay, so why did we get to this? My mother lodge is Royal Denby Lodge number 1143, which was formed in 1867 and had its 150th anniversary, obviously in 2017. And when we were doing a bit of research into the history of the lodge for the 150th anniversary sort of booklet, we came across the fact that actually there had been a Royal Denby Lodge prior to this, which was formed in 1787. And this nice picture is in one of the surviving minute books of the lodge, which is in Grand Lodge in London. And when we started to read the minutes from the early period, they came out with some reasons why the lodge failed. When we started to look into the provincial history, we realised actually over this period, it wasn't just Royal Denby that went through a short period for opening and closing with problems over attendance and discipline and so on. It happened elsewhere. So we started to see a pattern, which we then needed to be explaining as to why Freemasonry in North Wales find it so difficult to get established during this period. So why was North Wales Freemasonry the dog that didn't bark? And that's not my phrase, that's Professor Andrew Prescott's phrase. He uses in a paper called The British Problem. And he looks at Freemasonry from a British perspective. And there is a tendency that we look at it very much from the United Grand Lodge of England and the England umbrella, whilst we also know there is an Irish Grand Lodge and a Scottish Grand Lodge. That's fine. But we then realise actually there is no Welsh Freemasonry. There has never been a Welsh Grand Lodge. There's never been a Welsh language Freemasonry, Welsh ritual, Welsh regalia, or anything. So we tend to see Welsh Freemasonry as largely dominated by the Grand Lodges in London. And also, these early lodges would tend to be formed by outsiders, people coming in to work in the wool trade or whatever it may be in North Wales, particularly from the towns nearby and also from places like Lancashire and elsewhere. Which means that it doesn't really, Welsh Freemasonry during this period doesn't really have an indigenous flavour to it. And added to that, the provincial Grand Masters who were appointed during this period were also largely absentee landlords, although, as we will see, there wasn't much to be absent from, who had no real obvious connection with North Wales as an area. And there was no provincial Grand Lodges or supervision, which meant you tended to get these little small lodges that were widely spread across North Wales that were unsupervised, and which meant they were also prone to sort of Masonic ill discipline and internal quarrels, some of which come out in the paper. There are also more subtle forces at play, and maybe those who are English speaking or Anglican don't quite understand that in Wales particularly, obviously you have Welsh speaking tradition, particularly during this period, and aspects of religion, non-conformist religion, chapel rather than church, which means you've got a certain constituency of the population which isn't necessarily open to institutions like Freemasonry, which are perceived as being English-speaking and Anglican by tradition. But one of the more simple reasons, and again, the simple reasons are often the most powerful, is geography. For those people who've been to North Wales will know it's a mountainous area, largely in the interior, and even today is not the easiest place to get around. There's no motorways or anything like that. So in this period here, these are the locations where the lodges were opened. And as you can see, they're all over North Wales. They're spread all over all the different counties with no obvious connection between them. And to give you an idea of scale, even though it's not the biggest area in the world in terms of miles, for example, even today, I live near Denbigh, and if I want to go down and visit a lodge in Welshpool, which I sometimes do, on a Friday, the lodge I go visit in Welshpool Lodge meets on a Friday at 6 o'clock. And more or less, I've got to take half a day off on a Friday to get down there in time to get changed and get there in attendance. If I leave it too late, I just won't get there in time. And that's today with all the benefits of modern transport and cars. So if you go back to the 18th century when transport was done, but largely by, was done by horse and cart, there were no rail, the roads weren't as good quality as they are now, and you're traveling through mountainous areas, then really you're not, these lodges that were open and scattered across North Wales were never going to be able to support or visit each other, which also makes it difficult. Added to that is the climate, and my children always laugh at the joke about Wales being the land of rain, as they call it. And although, yes, it is historically has a sort of a damp climate. If you add this into the road system and the difficulties in transport and communication, then there is precious little chance in this period of any lodges really, even if they knew another lodge existed, of supporting it, visiting it, as well as not having any sort of large provincial oversight to sort of coordinate activities or provincial Grand Lodge to be a member of, which meant that these lodges were all acting individually in their own sort of small areas. And as you can see, this is the best way I could find to represent when the lodges technically opened and shut. And as you can see, as lodges opened and shut in a relatively short period of time, there wasn't a sort of centre of gravity or mass of North Wales Freemasonry at any real point. Added into this is the official dates, but Snowdon Lodge, for example, which is halfway up, never met at all. So even though it technically existed, there was no Freemasonry. There was no in Carnarvon at the period. Royal Denbigh was formed in 1787, as I say, but even though it was finally struck off by Grand Lodge in 1811, it actually only met for about 4 or 5 years. Okay, so if you look at the 1800s, for example, those lodges by and large weren't existing, so there was no Freemasonry, even though technically there were lodges on the Grand Lodge list. So one of the reasons why this happened, Welsh Freemasonry struggled, was that after 1536 there'd been essentially an act of political union between England and Wales, and a deliberate attempt to sort of subserviate Welsh politics and culture under English control. There was a formation of a single political union, cultural things like the dissolution of monasteries, such as this one near Llangollen, and this meant an absorption of the Welsh landed aristocracy into Westminster life and Westminster politics. There was the imposition of an English-speaking legal code, which obviously caused angst amongst the Welsh-speaking communities in Wales, as well as the creation of new sort of counties and the gradual domination of English towns over Welsh cultural and social life. And one of the reasons for that is again the geography. The lines of communication in North Wales tend to be east-west rather than north-south. So you get domination of English towns, and even today, this sort of is borne out culturally by what you may say are silly things such as football. So a lot of the kids in North Wales, although Wrexham is having a resurgence recently, they support teams like Manchester United and Liverpool. They're not particularly interested in teams in South Wales like Cardiff or Swansea. Okay. Now, this domination of English towns, the most important one in the history is Chester, which is the largest town to North Wales, even though it's really actually on the border between Wales and England. Very much an English city. It was a Roman city and it had a cathedral. It was the legal centre. It was a military centre, and became very much the biggest, most important sort of town, and the unofficial capital of North Wales. And to a certain extent, it still is. It is still the largest town, certainly that's and the easiest to get to in North Wales. So it's also important Masonically. So 1727 is the key date that is claimed as the formation of the province. But there is evidence of Freemasonry, and this comes out in the paper in Chester before 1717 and the creation of the Grand Lodge in London. Elias Ashmole was initiated down the road in Mornington in the 1840s, and there were evidence of speculative lodges opening in Chester, which led to a self-generated provincial Grand Lodge being formed in 1726, with Colonel Columbine as the first Grand Master. And he then handed over in 1727 to his warden, Captain Hugh Warburton. And you'll note the clue in terms of how the role of Chester is in North Wales is in his title, in North Wales at Chester. The new Grand Master in London appointed William Cowper as his deputy in 1727, and he was sent up to Chester to visit in this capacity as London were trying to sort of assimilate and sort of get some sort of sense of control and, over what was happening elsewhere in terms of speculative Freemasonry. The agreement was done, and Grand Lodge, Premier Grand Lodge in London, recognised Warburton in this new post. And as this came from the Grand Master, this is where the claim came for the province to be first be constituted. Now, that's fine in itself. However, there was no lodges in North Wales during this period. So in some sense, it's a slightly hollow position, which reflects the tendency at the time to appoint provincial Grand Masters to areas, geographical areas which had no lodges, but that didn't really matter. That wasn't quite the point. Warburton did have connections with North Wales, however, even though he was a Cheshire man. His family connections through to the Penryn area, the Penryn estate, which is near Bangor. Although being a military man, he was promoted. When he assumed command in 1734, he gave up his patent as provincial Grand Master. He eventually became general and spent a lot of his time abroad. He was followed by somebody, and again, there's an area of sort of historical interest here. Even though the record suggests it was a man called Sir Edward Matthews, there's no record of anyone called Sir Edward Matthews actually existing. And there is a suggestion that actually this is in essence, an 18th century typo. And it wasn't Sir Edward Matthews, it's Sir Edward Mansell, who was a second baronet of Trimsaran in South Wales, who'd been appointed provincial Grand Master for South Wales and also for Shropshire, and had North Wales added to his area in 1734. We may, if we can get documentation, we may at some point get to the bottom of this sort of slight gap in the knowledge. But in some ways, it doesn't really matter whether it was Matthews or Mansell, because there was no lodges in North Wales at this period. And the first lodge only came around in 1743. Now, in 1741, William Vaughan, who lived near Barmouth in the sort of southwest corner of North Wales, if that makes sense, he'd become Provincial Grand Master. Now, he was a Welsh speaker and interested in Welsh culture, but again was largely drawn to London. But during his jurisdiction, the first 5 lodges were open in North Wales. And they all have slightly, their history gives us some sense of how it was a bit haphazard and random as the lodges came around. Dolgellau was opened by Lancashire Masons working in the area in the wool trade after 1743. Quite a difficult place to get to, and I'm very questionable as to whether William Vaughan had anything really to do with them. And that lodge shut in the 1780 as the wool trade faced difficulties. Holywell, St. David's in Holywell opened in 1761. And again, there's little evidence of that lodge actually surviving for very long, even though Holywell is actually quite an interesting area, quite close to Chester, which is where the sort of impetus came from. And there's also coal mining and copper smelting and things like that. So that's why that lodge opened, but again, didn't survive very long. And then we get a slight outlier, the first lodge in Welshpool, which came under the Ancients umbrella in 1766, which again shows you how Freemasonry wasn't quite as organized as you might perceive it today. That lodge actually did quite well initially, and then fell under the problems of being linked. There was an election in Welshpool area, and this is the time when there was sort of politics without democracy, and the electorate was a very small, usually the landed aristocracy who would have known each other, and some of whom were members of the lodge. There was a very acrimonious election, which bled into the sort of disharmony in the lodge, and then the lodge ended up shutting. The lodge in Holyhead, Mona, was open again with direct blessing from London, because the Grand Secretary had been travelling through Holyhead on the way to Dublin and was accosted and agreed to the opening of the lodge, and a warrant was sent. But Holyhead, at the end of Anglesey, had a lot of seafaring brethren, which meant the lodge struggled to meet and get a quorum, and also there's a lot of Masonic ill discipline there, and without any sort of supervision or anyone to visit, and stuck on the end of Anglesey, that lodge soon went into decline and again was struck off. The other lodge we opened in this period was Rabban Lodge at Winstay, which was really the plating of the 4th baronet of Winstay, Sir Watkin Williams Wynne. Again, numbered 415, which seems slightly strange. That lodge moved without dispensation and was eventually struck off. But we start to get some lodges opened. And then William Vaughan hands over to this interesting character called George Durant, Oxford-educated man who, after coming down from university, later has an affair with the wife of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he's packed off to join the army to get him out of the way, and ends up in the Caribbean and at the siege of Havana. And he's a paymaster. And as well as this, as other sort of slave owning and other other sort of things he was doing in the Caribbean. He ended up becoming extremely wealthy. And on his return to Shropshire, bought an entire village, the entire village of Tong, did up the hall, did up the grounds, and was given the provincial Grand Master for North Wales, but doesn't appear to have done anything, Masonically speaking, as his Masonic life was centered in London. And then when he finishes, there was a period of 11 years where Shropshire and also North Wales had no provincial Grand Master. But during this period, two more lodges were opened. And the top one, that's Denbigh Castle, was Royal Denbigh 515, as I've already alluded, which was an offshoot of Chester. The people of Denbigh who wanted to open a lodge had to go to Chester to get a warrant. The Chester Masons some Chester Masons then visited Denbigh for a 2 or 3 month period, initiated some people, installed a master of the lodge, and then left and never came back. And as a result of this, the first master, who was master for 3 years in a row, had only been initiated 3 months before, and they didn't really know what they were doing, which it sort of comes out in the minutes. And the lodge rapidly went into decline and stopped meeting after about 1791, 1792, being struck off in 1811. The bottom castle is Carnarvon Castle, which is where Snowdon Lodge was supposed to have been consecrated, but there's no evidence of ever actually meeting. So 2 lodges were created or warranted for during this period, but others were shut. So by the 1791, and there's not a lot happening in North Wales. There's 3 lodges left. Now, the next provincial Grand Master was Francis Egerton, who was appointed in 1780, from 1786 to 1811. He constituted 2 lodges during his time. A second one at Holywell, which actually there's evidence that did quite well for a period, but then suddenly stopped selling returns to Grand Lodge, and that's never quite got to the bottom of the research or any evidence as to why it suddenly stopped meeting, because Holywell was quite a prosperous place at the time. Another lodge opened in Winstay, and then this time it came under the auspices of the 5th Baronet, another Sir Watkin, although he was a military man and ended up fighting the Napoleonic Wars. And without his patronage, that lodge sort of went into decline and was eventually erased. Egerton himself was an interesting character. He was provincial Grand Master for Staffordshire, Shropshire, and had Grand Lodge give him another 3 counties of North Wales in his patent in 1791. But sometime during his midlife, he left the area, went to live in Paris. There is some evidence that he was initiated as a Freemason in Paris in the first place, and so he wasn't really present to do much about Freemasonry in North Wales. Now, there was 5 lodges shut during his tenure. I think when he started, there was 3. He added 2, so this in effect meant by the time he'd finished in 1811, there was no Freemasonry left in North Wales again. So after 1811, we've got 2 provincial Grand Masters who were appointed, again of an area without any lodges actually existing, and for reasons other than any connection with North Wales. The first one, I never quite got to the bottom of why he was appointed, was a man called William Rawlins, who had interest in St. Kitts in the Caribbean. Again, another person involved in slavery and slave owning in the States, who there was problems with the family adjudication of the estates. He came back to London, joined lodges in London. That's where his masonry was based, and he technically was provincial Grand Master for only 3 years. But again, there was no lodges to visit, so there's no evidence of him actually doing anything. The man on the right, Philip Godsall, he's an interesting character. Was a coachmaker based in London, and because he was a coachmaker, he was very well connected in London society, particularly the aristocracy and royalty, and also wealthy. And so he also financed some of these people as well, which meant obviously he was sort of a man of influence. And even though he wasn't aristocracy himself, this meant he was given when he became a Freemason, he attended some quite important meetings and was given the provincial Grand Mastership of Anglesey, I think, as a bit of an honorarium, as I say, because there was no lodges present during this period. So we have another interregnum with no masonry happening until 1826, and then by its fingertips, Freemasonry returns to North Wales. And the impetus for this comes in the opening of the Telfords post route through from London through to Holyhead. In 1800, they had an active union with Ireland, and the English needed to get across, and the Irish MPs as well needed to get to Westminster, and the English needed to get across to Ireland, as well as the military forces. Telford was commissioned to come up with a route, and he did, through the mountains of Snowdonia, which is now the A5, and he built this was the world's largest suspension bridge across the Menai. Now, the nearest town is Bangor, and obviously the building of the bridge attracted not just people working on the bridge, it attracted all the ancillary trades and businessmen and so on to the area. Some of these were Freemasons, and the lodge was opened by a mix of Lancashire, Cheshire, Scots, and Irish Freemasons in 1826. And this lodge survives and becomes essentially the mother lodge of all the other lodges in North Wales. And at the same time, we get a new provincial Grand Master. Now, Henry Grey Bennett, again, was another Shropshire man, a radical Whig MP who obviously would have spent a lot of time in London. And in 1820, he was appointed in 1819, but in 1824, two of his children died. He ended up going on a holiday to Europe shortly after, got embroiled in a legal dispute, became sort of disgraced, had to resign as MP, and spent the last 10 years of his life in sort of seclusion near Lake Como in Italy, which meant that during his period as Provincial Grand Master, there were no lodges in North Wales, or the two that were formed in North Wales were formed after he'd left the country. So he can't have had any influence over Freemasonry in North Wales during this period. And that comes out in the history of the lodges that were formed, one of which was Flitcher Lodge, which met at this place, Plasteg, rumoured to be one of the most haunted houses in Wales, which is just outside Mold. And this lodge was formed by a lot of Chester Masons and visitors from London in 1826, at the same time as St. David's, but really struggled in the sort of post-Napoleonic economic climate, open for 2-3 years, and then declined and was shut. Fortunately, St. David's Lodge survived. And even though it struggled in the late 1830s and early 1940s and didn't meet, that was largely because of economic and political issues across Wales, the Hungry Forties, as they're known. But it was on the route, importantly on the route through to Holyhead, which meant there was enough life and economic life in the area to just about sustain a lodge, and just about sending enough returns to Grand Lodge to means that the Grand Lodge recognised its centenary in 1926, and it's approaching its bicentenary. But as well as Stevenson's Bridge, we get a later bridge as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. So after Bennett, again, there's another interregnum for 7 years with no provincial Grand Master and therefore no provincial Grand Lodge, and just one lodge working, which is St. David's in Bangor. Now, with the advent of rail travel, there's a realization that actually we need to take the advantage of rail travel, and a rail line was proposed to link Chester to Holyhead, which still exists. Stevenson proposed crossing the Menai with a separate bridge, the Britannia Bridge, which still exists, a tubular bridge, which was opened in 1849, which again attracts a business and Freemasons to Bangor, and gives an impetus to St. David's Lodge, and which means St. David's Lodge clings on just long enough to survive until the appointment of Sir Watkin Williams-Wynn, 6th Baronet, as Provincial Grand Master in 1852. And his arrival and the arrival of the railways opens up North Wales to industry and tourism, and allows for a resurgence after the 1850s. Before he took over, we get the last Provincial Grand Master during this period, which was Sir Andrew Corbett, who lived at Acton Raynald in Shropshire. And he was appointed in 1843, not long after Sir Watkin had been initiated at a lodge in Chester. And he actually refused to do anything, basically. He was given the job and didn't really want it. He returned his patent, refused to do anything. And I've never quite worked out, or not quite worked out, why he didn't really choose to be involved. And my suspicion is he perceived himself as not the man for the job. He didn't fall out with Freemasonry particularly, and actually he attended the installation of Sir Watkin as his successor in 1852, which suggests that it wasn't Freemasonry he was upset with. It was maybe a realization that there wasn't much for him to do, and maybe he thought he probably wasn't the man for the job. But I haven't quite got to the bottom of that. Either way, so what conclusions can we draw about why North Wales Freemasonry didn't work, or didn't sort of consolidate itself during this period? The obvious one is the lack of provincial leadership, either through a Grand Master who had connections to North Wales, or the existence of a provincial Grand Lodge to which private lodges could participate. Linked to that, or connected, you have these issues about transport and communications, as I've already mentioned. Lodges spread all across North Wales, unable to communicate with each other, even if they knew each other existed or visit. It was still a largely agrarian economy, lack of urbanization in large towns, or a concentration of population. And again, there's a piece at the end of the paper where I contrast that with what happened in Lancashire during the same period, where, okay, lodges were open and shut, But when you've got the development of cities like Liverpool and Manchester with provincial Grand Masters living in those urban areas, lodges were able to visit each other. You have provincial Grand Lodges meeting, and it suddenly becomes a bit more, the whole thing becomes a bit more coherent. Connected to that, as I've already mentioned earlier, Wales is not England. You've got to speak literally speaks a different language. And there is this religious thing, which I wouldn't want to overplay, but it means that if you've got a society that is perceived as being Anglican and English speaking, a certain part of the population are not won't be predisposed to join it, whereas they might be predisposed to join other societies like the Oddfellows, for example. And here we have, and you'll notice it with Welsh Chapel. This is one of the things, and if you also note that all the signage is all in Welsh. And this is one of the things, when you visit Wales, you see all these chapels and all the villages and towns. It's a whole different thing. But connected to this was the historical tradition of what we call tithes. Now, this is a tithe map, and actually is a tithe map of the area. I live on a farm, and it's a tithe map of the farm. So you can see the roads reasonably obviously, and then the old field boundaries. And when I first came to this area, had to learn the names of all the fields. And they all have Welsh names, Frith Grai, Cai Pant, Penamynydd, and so on. And then we got to this one field, which is actually this area here. And this is known as the Parsons Field. So I asked the question, why is that known as the Parsons Field? Because the system of tithes was such that every farm, every landowner, every business had to give a tenth of its wealth every year to the church. Now, the family I married into were church going, so they didn't really object to this. But if you imagine that you're a nonconformist Welsh-speaking chapel goer, to be forced to give up 10% of your income to a church you didn't want to attend and never went to is going to be pretty galling. And it did lead to some real sort of the tithe wars of the 1880s, where people actually were killed and riots were held and things like that, and eventually led to this disestablishment of the church in Wales in 1920. So these things are not to be underestimated in terms of the available population who were going to be Freemasons. And here's an example of this, which came out slightly later, but is a good way of illustrating it. These two men are brothers. The man on the right is the fourth Baronet of Bodelwyddan, and the man on the left is his younger brother, who at one time was Vicar of Bodelwyddan. And those of you who've driven along the A55 in North Wales going on holiday may have picked out the marble church by the side of the road, in which is part of the Bodelwyddan Castle and the Bodelwyddan Estate. Now, the fourth Baronet on the right became a provincial Grand Master in 1903, and his younger brother on the left, an Oxford-educated cleric, later became the Lord Bishop of Bangor. And when they were both past masters of Royal Denbigh Lodge, and when Sir William became provincial Grand Master in 1903, the lodge presented an address to him, and there's a list of all the members of the lodge. I think there was 42 at the time. And if you look down it, apart from Watkin Herbert Williams, Lord Bishop of Bangor, and there are 13 or 14 other reverends, Anglican vicars in the lodge. So a third of the lodge membership were Anglican vicars, English speaking, church. A lot of the others were professional men, doctors, lawyers, and so on. So you can see how Welsh Freemasonry developed along particular social lines, which meant, on top of all the other factors around geography and everything else as well, meant it was always going to be difficult for North Wales Freemasonry to become really established during this period. And again, this language issue shouldn't be underestimated. It was only a couple of years ago that the first Welsh-speaking lodge in North Wales was opened, momentous occasion, and rightly celebrated. But if it's taken Grand Lodge over 300 years to allow Freemasonry to be Welsh-speaking, then you can imagine in the 1780s and 90s how this was never going to happen, and so the consequences thereof. So, just in conclusion, when can North Wales really claim its lineage? As its first provincial Grand Master, possibly 1727, but there was no lodges. First lodge wasn't until 1743. But actually, the continuous working, which is what private lodges have to demonstrate, happened since 1826, and there hasn't been a continuous provincial Grand Lodge since 1752. North Wales as a separate province only came about in 1885. Prior to that, it had always been connected to Shropshire and/or Staffordshire and/or South Wales. So is that the date we should choose? And I suspect that most people, as Freemasons like their historical connections, will be celebrating our tercentenary in 3 years' time. Thank you for listening. And I say the paper is available via the QC website, or will be in the next 2024 edition of AQC. If you have any questions, I would like to answer them, and you can be contacted through the QC. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that.